Hello, welcome to The Finish Line, a public affairs show from Beverly, Mass. and throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Dean Cavaretta, directed by Michael Gendre. With us today, our very special guest, Dan Fishman, Beverly resident, political activist. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Dean, for having me.
Thanks for coming into The Finish Line.
Happy to be here.
Your experience in Massachusetts politics is rather unique. You ran in the 2012 cycle as a Libertarian candidate for Congress up here in the North Shore.
Yep, I had a specific event that catalyzed me into doing that when the government passed the National Defense Authorization Act in 2011. They suspended habeas corpus. They said that under suspicion of terrorism, they could take you in, ask you a couple questions, hold you without the right to an attorney, without a right to a speedy trial. That's a big change in the way our country runs.
Right.
And for me, that had an effect on me personally. The reason that my family came over here was my family's originally from Russia. One day my grandmother's family came home and their father was gone. And the neighbor said, "Oh yeah, the police took him." They went down to the police station and he was gone.
Yeah.
So that's when they realized, yeah, it's time to leave and come to a country where freedom is supposed to be guaranteed.
Right.
So when they suspended habeas corpus and they said they can lock you up for maybe going to an Al Jazeera website or some other place if you're interested in finding, a source of news that is more than just American or alternative or something like that, I don't think that's suspicious. I think that that's actually our duty.
Right. Well, you took it a step further. You decided to run for public office, run for the Congress in a competitive situation with numerous other candidates. And in your situation, having run on the Libertarian ticket, I think what we wanted to do in this first segment is talk about the philosophy of libertarianism, why that appealed to you and how you got involved in that,
Sure.
And how you see that political strain, if you will, different than the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
One of the most important things that I tell everybody about libertarianism is to remember that we at times are seen as spoilers by the Republicans and the Democrats. And so there's a lot of misinformation about what the Libertarian Party actually stands for. The core of what we believe in is what we call the non-aggression principle. The idea that it's not okay to use force against another person except in self-defense. So you cannot aggressively use force. And we apply that to almost every aspect of our philosophy. So as an example, we frequently say that income tax, why do you pay taxes? Some people say they pay taxes for good schools, pay taxes for good roads. But really, you pay taxes because if you didn't, they'd lock you up and throw you in jail. Mm-hmm. That is an example of an application of force that we consider unacceptable. Now, I want good roads. I want good schools. I want us to work together. But I don't think that force is an adequate compulsion. I don't think that we should use force in that way to say this is why we should collect taxes. Libertarianism goes beyond that too, because when we talk about our non-aggression principle, we talk about other aspects of government. When we say, okay, is it right for government to legislate morality? Are we going to use the power of government, force, to say this is how we think you should live your life? Or are we going to say fundamentally we think you should have as much liberty as you can handle in your personal life, and as long as you're not hurting anybody else, we think that's okay.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. I think during the break we talked about the 1964 presidential election,
right,
or what was going to be the 64 election between President Kennedy and Goldwater. As we know, that did not come to pass with the assassination in 1963. Talk a little bit about Goldwater, his political legacy, and how you were attracted to him, and then compare that to the Republican Party that came after.
Well, one of the interesting things is, the big quote that everybody knows about Barry Goldwater is, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And knowing what liberty is, and that the flip side of liberty is tolerance, because I don't have any liberty unless everybody tolerates me exercising it. Understanding that, that's what Goldwater represented. That's what the Republican Party was about at that point in time. Things changed. Really, when Richard Nixon got elected, that was sort of the beginning of the new Republican era, right? We'd seen Johnson take over. We saw the Civil Rights Act passed. When Nixon took over, things changed a little bit in terms of how the Republican Party started running and winning elections. Obviously, Nixon loses in this, debacle, or he
74.
He ruins the Republican Party when he has to resign, and so Carter's elected for 4 disastrous years. But then when Reagan rises up, you see a change in the Republican Party. Now, at that point in time, it had been close. Remember, Reagan loses the floor fight to Ford in '76.
Right, almost was named vice president.
Exactly right. And instead, what happens is that when Reagan comes to power in '80, he says, well, we're going to do what we have to do to build this coalition and recognize that sometimes the moderates are actually damaging to us because the moderates are not willing to go all the way. And so Reagan started to build this moral majority. You know, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, you saw the rise of those guys in the Republican Party. I had been a Republican up until the mid-'80s. And really, 83, 84 was when I started to realize there wasn't room for me.
You know, it's interesting, Dan, looking back at that time period, which was impactful on me and my activism as well. World events, foreign affairs, the Cold War cobbled together and held together the Republican coalition, the Reagan coalition, and then he expanded it in 1980, 1984 with blue-collar Reagan Democrats. It's interesting to look back and see that Reagan was assisted by those big events.
Right.
And since then, the factions, the different sections within the Republican Party have really come to fore. What do you feel? How do you feel about libertarianism within the Republican Party, or do you feel that it's better apart from the Republican Party?
I think that one of the things we say all the time is that if you are a true proponent of liberty, you never have to recant any of your positions. So when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed in 1994, it was a Republican Congress and a Democratic president. And they all signed off on it. And the Libertarian Party immediately said, no, this is not what government's about. Government's power should not extend to the idea of who can get married, because really, why is that an issue, especially of the federal government? So when there are people who say that they're Republican libertarians and they say that they are in favor of smaller government, I question their commitment to the cause, because there are a lot of times that Republicans say that they want smaller government, but really what they want is they want smaller Democratic government and larger Republican government.
Yeah.
And the Democrats are the same way. You see a lot of things that happen in the Progressive Caucus, and they say, oh, government is overreaching its power because you shouldn't get involved in that. But really, we see Democrats expanding government programs all over the place.
I think what's interesting on their side is they're trying to be the more progressive. How they're trying to outdo each other on the far left, and you're seeing that in more and more elections. You're seeing that within the state Democratic Party.
Both sides are interested in legislating morality. All they're arguing about is whose morality should be in charge. And the worst thing that's happening is because they agree that legislating morality is okay, the country keeps getting torn one direction and the other, depending on who comes to power.
Right. It sounds to me like you're one of these libertarians that favors a coalition around libertarianism that includes Republicans, not the other way around.
I could favor a coalition around personal liberty with the idea that that government governs best, which governs least.
So that would be the unifying force, personal
exactly.
liberty, right?
And recognizing the fact that, you look at what happened in this last election, we say, oh, there's this massive turnout, but really, we know there was no candidate elected who got 50% of the registered voters vote because there wasn't that kind of turnout. So when we say somebody actually got elected by 15% of the registered voters or 20% of the registered voters, what we're saying is that because of voter apathy, we're giving these people the right to dictate how everybody gets to live. I disagree with that. I think that government should not have that power. If you have a real mandate, that means that 70, 80% of the people are voting for you. And that's happened in the past when the country has been galvanized.
Right.
But when we're all apathetic about what's happening, then we shouldn't be making these broad-reaching laws. You look at the Affordable Care Act. There have been, I believe, 42 votes to repeal it now. Those congressmen did not go home and lose elections, right? They're representing the actual will of the people at this point in time. And when we realize that that many people are unhappy, we should realize that government has overstepped its bounds. Yeah. A government that has to govern that broadly, that is beyond the scope of personal liberty, because 59 million people in 2004 voted against George Bush. In 2008, 59 million people voted against Barack Obama. Exactly the same number. I mean, it's off by a couple 100,000. If our government requires that 59 million people are unhappy, we're doing things much too large a scale.
And it sounds to me like that's your argument, that there is a room at the table for a libertarian point of view because of the how many voters are voting against one of the major parties.
Yeah, exactly.
And if there's room for the libertarians, there might be room for other groups as well.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing that in different states. We talked about this a couple weeks ago about Evan Falchuk, who ran as an independent. He'll be setting up another party here in Massachusetts.
He got 3.3%. He is forming town committees right now, and actually he has been contacted immediately by candidates who want to run, including some former Republicans and Democrats who are saying, yeah, I left the party, but these are actually people who had held office in the past. And this was something I didn't see coming.
Yeah.
But the fact that, there are, guys who are like that, who used to be in the party and they got pushed out, but they're actually good politicians, good campaigners. They have the potential to really change Massachusetts politics.
Right, and I think what it does is it creates a competitive system where the major parties are going to have to go out and recruit people to their cause, to be attractive, to sell their message and platform and try to compete in the marketplace of ideas.
Right, and I think that is the real thing that libertarians do best, is to make us realize that we have overlaps that the parties currently don't want us to realize. The Republicans know they win by demonizing the Democrats. The Democrats, they know by demonizing the Republicans, by galvanizing their base. We've already talked about the fact that we know there's a mostly apathetic voter base, and so getting your troops to the polls is what wins elections. So that means for the Democrats, they have to always make it seem like an imperative. If you don't come out right now, the Republicans are going to ban abortion. They're going to make it so that you can only get married in the church that they choose.
Take away government programs.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And the Republicans are the same sort of thing. They say if you don't come out and vote, the Democrats are going to take away all of your guns.
So that actually leads me to my next question, Dan. In a competitive marketplace of ideas, in a competitive democracy, in a two-party system that we have now, and you've run now for office, and you know that the majority of voters here in Massachusetts are unenrolled independents who can pick and choose their candidates.
Right.
What do you feel is a winning message to those unenrolled voters that make up the bulk of voters here in Beverly or other towns on the North Shore or across Massachusetts, from a libertarian point of view? I
think what we see is that the idea of personal liberty is always a winner. So libertarians have been out in front on the issue of same-sex marriage. We've been out in front on the ending the prohibition on cannabis. Right now, I think we are out in front of the idea that police violence is currently out of control. These are issues that people wake up to and they're like, this is impacting my civil liberty. The fact that, I'm a responsible adult and, I don't think that marijuana smoking in my own house is dangerous to somebody, or if somebody needs medical marijuana for an issue or something like that. These are issues of personal liberty that people are recognizing government should not be intruding on. And as we increase the ability of government to surveil us, read our email, video cameras everywhere, an amazing website came online today. It's Russian-based, but every web camera in the world that had the default administrator and password set on it, you could log into it. So there were 73,000 webcams in the United States that they had a whole list of. You could just click on them there. I looked at like 13 in Boston.
The overreach of government power in the age of terrorism.
Exactly right. And so that's one of the things that people realize now, is that we have this commonality that fundamentally we are all minorities of one. And because we are minorities of one, we should be defending all civil liberties.
Right.
A battle for liberty anywhere is a battle for liberty everywhere. What we have to do is find a way to agree that that's the fight that we have to fight together.
Right. You're listening to Dan Fishman. This is the public affairs show, The Finish Line. I'm your host, Dean Cavaretta, directed by Michael Gendre. Dan, as we move around here to different issues, we talked about the impact of Ron Paul and his political career on you. He is a Texas congressman that started his career as a Republican and has been one of the leading voices of the libertarian movement in his different presidential campaigns. What was about Ron Paul that attracted you?
One of the very first things, and so I should point out that I actually grew up in Galveston, Texas, where Ron Paul was a congressman. I was not really familiar with him, though, at the time, until I came to Massachusetts and I moved here in '94. One of the very first things that made me understand that Ron Paul was talking about something different than every other elected official was he talked about the Federal Reserve and the impact that it has on government and how things are run. When Ron Paul started talking about auditing the Federal Reserve to find out what's actually happening with the money, are they printing money? Is there some accountability? And the stonewalling the government put up in front of them, that's when we began to realize they're baking the books. And we look at what's been happening recently with the quantitative easing program. Right now the government is buying $48 billion a month of bonds, stocks, and they're making the stock market go up.
Right. And for normal people at home, basically what the Fed is doing in running monetary policy is printing more money to prop up the banking system and the money supply. And the negative effects are, from your point of view?
Well, so what's happening is that we see stocks going up because the government is buying those stocks. So people who own stock are becoming wealthier. But because they're printing that money, they are deflating the currency. So people who have money in savings account are getting poorer. We are seeing a direct transfer of money from the people who are saving to the people who are investing. And that's a terrible thing. That is government picking winners. When in reality, the people who put money in their savings account, they're putting it there because they think it's safe.
Yeah. Now, sticking with money issues for a second, libertarians, and now I mean, you're speaking for yourself, so obviously there might be differences within your party. What is the view of most libertarians on the income tax or taxation in general?
So taxation has a purpose, okay? Libertarians are not anarchists. And so one of the important things to talk about with the Libertarian Party and things that people aren't necessarily aware of.
What's a minimal vision of government?
Exactly right. And so in the very early days of the Libertarian Party, there was this thing called the Dallas Accords, where the minarchists, the people who believe that there's a purpose, some limited government, and the anarchists agreed that they were going to stop fighting against each other because they're killing the cause. Everybody can agree that government can be smaller. Let's take that first step together. And that's something that, we still battle on sometimes. But when we talk about taxes, one of the things that I believe, and I should point out there's some libertarians who don't agree with this, but, well, one of the things that we all agree upon is we know that if you tax cigarettes to stop people from smoking, that works. If you tax sin tax on alcohol to cut down on drinking, that has an effect. Why are we taxing income? Do we want people to stop earning money?
Yeah.
No, of course not. But we know that that's what happens. So for me, I'm in favor of getting rid of income tax in general, and I would like to see a consumption tax come back. Yeah. The one that I'm currently in favor on is what's called the fair tax. It's at fairtax.org. I think it's a good idea. It essentially puts a 28% sales tax on everything.
Eliminates the income tax.
Eliminates the income tax, Social Security, everything entirely, and there's a prebate. So every citizen in the United States gets $2,000 a month from the government. So you also get rid of the need for welfare at that point in time because that comes in the form of the prebate. So then people are spending taxes and stuff like that, and we wouldn't tax the absolute necessities. Food, fuel, and rent.
Right.
You wouldn't have to pay taxes
right.
on. But to buy a house, you would have to pay tax
right.
on that.
Interesting. Turning to the Citizens United Supreme Court decision when it comes to campaign spending, I know you had some views on that decision as well.
So one of the things that I hate is when people characterize Citizens United as having anything to do with corporate personhood. That is a complete lie. It is not true. It doesn't say corporate personhood anywhere. Corporate personhood was established in the 1830s so that people could sue corporations. That's a good thing. Now, when we talk about what a corporation is actually a way that a businessman can take a risk and make sure that he doesn't lose his house. 95% of the corporations in the United States are one-person corporations. Most lawyers that you know, dentists, small-time doctors. So when we're talking about limiting people's speech, we're really talking about most of these people wanting to be able to spend their money. My argument is that, when Citizens United also protects unions and their right to spend speech. My argument is that that name, Citizens United, should be an example to us of what we're talking about. The First Amendment guarantees our right to assemble and our right to speech. At no point when people come together, whether it's in a union or in a corporation, or if we were to form a political action committee, does our association, our assembling together, limit our right to speech.
Right.
Now, the ACLU, who most people would agree is fundamentally not a conservative organization, has come out and said that the Citizens United decision was 100% correct. And what should really happen is that if we're concerned about finance, we should find a way to amplify other people's voices,
right,
but not to limit speech, because limiting speech is a slippery slope.
Right. And I think with what we've seen with these elections that just happened last Tuesday is that spending doesn't necessarily mean success. Having a message that resonates with the voters and connecting with real people and doing the things that campaigns need to do is also important as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Money just doesn't automatically mean success. It is a factor.
Well, it is, but there's a great study out by the guys who did Freakonomics, and I think that their work in economics is earth-shattering, where they've proven that over a certain point, money has very little impact. Right. And in general, you can so John Connolly, who people most famously know as having been in the car when Kennedy got shot,
right,
but
he ran as an independent for president.
No, he ran as a Republican.
Okay.
And he spent more money in the Republican primary than anybody spent in the entire general election up until 8 years ago. And absolutely no success. Did not win the primary. Spending doesn't win. The candidate has to win. And I'll give you another great example in our most recent election. Jeff McCormick ran as an independent in Massachusetts. He finished behind a small-minded bigot who has written legislation saying that being gay should be illegal.
Right, and none of his spending equated to
exactly.
votes.
He spent millions of dollars, and he ended up, with maybe 12,000 votes.
Yeah. Let's turn to some other issues while we're talking about libertarianism, the appeal of it. What are you seeing in Massachusetts? Why do you think young people, millennials, are gravitating towards
I think
Ron Paul, Rand Paul, other campaigns?
I think that young people have grown up in an era where we have extreme tolerance, right? We have advanced in society where most people are now at a state where they say, yeah, whatever you want to do, because there's more out there, there's more opportunity for people to live their lives in such a wide variety of ways. More careers available than ever before. The internet with a million different philosophies, different religions, whatever people want, and people being exposed to that. And they're like, yeah, whatever you want to do, that's probably okay. And so we have really become tolerant, especially this most recent generation. And as they become tolerant, they realize you ought to be able to do whatever you want, and that's liberty. Liberty and tolerance are so closely related, and that's one of the things that I always talk about. We were talking earlier about Republicans who say they're libertarians. You have to show me that you're tolerant in order for me to believe that you're truly libertarian.
Right. Right, so that's interesting. You approach the issues in such a way that you're arguing that the libertarian argument or the strand of republicanism can be more appealing and broad-based in the sense that you go back to personal liberty.
Right, and it should be. And one of the things that I talk about all the time is that Republicans, if they say that they're small government, they should really be pushing the issues where they are strong for small government. And they talk about ending business regulations, minimizing government oversight. Common Core, for example, most Republicans oppose that because Common Core is the idea of a one-size-fits-all. Right. Exactly what's wrong with
taking away local control or
exactly.
local freedom.
Right, exactly what's wrong with our 330 million person government working with one broad paintbrush.
Right.
Finding a way for the Republican Party to stand up and say, these are our issues where we want to promote personal liberty, and then in the other issues, getting away from their legislation and morality. That's everybody's path to winning. Right. Not just Republican, not just Democrat, not just Libertarian. The people of the United States, we win when we stand up for liberty.
Let's talk a moment about Senator Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul, who's carved out his own successful political career, been elected in his own right.
Yep.
How do you see them different, and how do you see them similar, other than their last name being the same?
So I think that Ron was more of a purist. I think that you see a lot of times Rand Paul is more into the political game, working towards compromises.
And we should say that he's a registered Republican.
He is a registered Republican, and Ron Paul was also a registered Republican. Ron had the benefit of having a small area in Texas that he was running for. Remember, the House, you only have 770,000 constituents.
Part of a state.
Exactly right. Rand Paul has done a lot of things that I really admire. I thought that his filibuster, saying that should until he got an assurance from the president that the president would not use drone strikes to kill Americans in the United States. Yeah, that's good. We should stand up for that sort of thing. It's worth holding up the business of government. However, when we talk about some of the other issues that he's been on, sometimes I worry that he's making compromises. Now,
let me ask you this. What do you think his impact has been on the other Republican members?
I think that he has encouraged a lot of Republicans to buck the system. I mean, a lot of people saw that when Rand stood up for liberty, he got national attention. And tons of Democrats and liberals stood up and applauded when he did that filibuster, because that's something that everybody should be agreeing upon. And in fact, one of the things that somebody said is that I wish the Democrats had fought that hard when we invaded Iraq the first time. I wish that they hadn't just voted away the rights to the president to go invade Iraq. Where was the filibuster then?
Right.
How is there not anybody willing to stand up on the floor? And that's just one person. And we are talking about Hillary Clinton at that point in time.
Right.
We're talking about every Democratic senator. Nobody was willing to stand up and filibuster against that.
Right.
And so in those respects, I think that Rand has shown that there is a different way. You don't have to be beholden to the party, because I don't think the party was thrilled with what he was doing.
Yeah.
He did that just by himself.
Looking ahead to 2016, 2018, 2020, how do you see the liberty movement in New England in particular, in Massachusetts, and what are the goals for the party?
So we have a couple specific goals. We're working towards a ballot initiative to change the general law to instruct the auditor to keep track of all the police shootings in Massachusetts. I think this is, again, an area of personal liberty where we're actually out in front. Right now, we know that there's a problem with police violence. We saw it in Ferguson. We've seen, police shootings around the country where right now there's just not an accountability. And I believe the first level of accountability is transparency. And so if we have the auditor keeping track of all those things, I think that's going to help bring to light what's actually happening. The next step is to also grow the party. So we ran 7 candidates across the state this year. Some of them, did very well. Some of them had tough campaigns. But what they all did is they built organizations. Mm-hmm. And so that's the step, is now to go from candidate to organization. Build your local organization, and then the next step is to run again, but this time with the organization that you've built.
Right. So we have about a minute left in this segment. So we've been talking to Dan Fishman, Beverly political activist, former candidate for Congress, and talking about the libertarian movement here in America, in the Northeast. So in 30 seconds left, Dan, how do you see? What do you see as being one of the challenges for the libertarian movement, or the party in general, cracking the other 2 parties, or what's a big challenge? The
big problem is that we represent a threat to both the Republican and Democratic parties. Not to Republicans and Democrats, but to the parties themselves, because our liberty involves saying you ought to be free to vote what you want. And if you're a Republican and Democratic idea appeals to you, you ought to be able to vote that way. And so the Republican and the Democratic parties don't like that, because they don't like when people break ranks.
Right. Well, we'll continue our conversation. We've been talking to Dan Fishman. This has been segment number 1 of The Finish Line. I'm your host, Dean Cavaretta. We'll be back right after this.